This podcast is brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling for those who make and drink great spirits. Join our free email newsletter for technical and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Learn more at spiritsanddistilling.com.
Hello, welcome to the Craft Spirits and Distilling podcast. I'm your host, Molly Troupe, and this is episode 10 with Andy Nelson from Nelson's Brier Distillery in Tennessee. Andy is the co-founder and was the head distiller at Nelson's and has since moved on as of March of this year to different pastures. He is currently a consultant for Big Thirst, which is led by Mark Schilling, and has many years of industry experience and a lot of wisdom to share about not just launching a product and making sure that it's great, but then also all the different things that fall under the founder's job description as well. So we'll talk a lot about both of those aspects and how to balance those things. Before we get into all of that, G&D Chillers understands that each distillery's chilling requirements are unique. On every distillery project, G&D offers the front-end design and engineering your team needs at no cost to you. Rebecca Harris, president and head distiller of Catoctin Creek Distillery, recently shared, "Service after the sale is what really separates the quality of a supplier relationship. G&D Chillers has always been a phone call away when we needed them. For a small business like mine, that partnership makes all the difference. Whether you distill batch by batch or in a continuous operation for more than 30 years, G&D has had the proven solution. Visit them today at gndchillers.com. And for over 11 years, ABS Commercial has been your full-service equipment manufacturer, designing quality distillation equipment ranging from 50 liters to 5,000 liters. Whether establishing a new distillery or expanding into a brew distillery, their team of experienced engineers and designers work with you to develop customized distilling solutions. With their consultative approach, they tailor to your production capacity, space constraints, and budgetary considerations to help you create quality crafted spirits. Contact them today at sales@abs-commercial.com to discuss your customized distilling needs." Andy, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I would love it if we could just dive in and you can tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into this crazy world of distilling.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting way to get into it, but I find it interesting because so many people will kind of get into this world in ways that are kind of unexpected. I find it actually a rarity that someone kind of grows up in this industry in so many ways. And so I came at it from the historical angle. I discovered along with my brother that my family had a long history, an important history in the distilling here in Tennessee, and had a big distillery, Nelson's Brier, and it had shut down because of Prohibition, and it just became this spark of passion for us that we knew we had to get restarted. So that's how we started from, we studied both philosophy in school, so we weren't necessarily preparing for anything in particular, but I actually like to think that prepared us both for kind of everything. So that's my quick explanation of how I got into the business. And then it was figuring out how to, it was in so many ways, just jumping off and building a parachute on the way down.
When did you become aware of your family history? Like, how old were you at that time?
At that time, that was 2006. So I was 23, not quite yet 24. And I just graduated college. But I had heard a little bit about, in very, very vague, I was going to say in vague detail, but I wouldn't use the word detail at all, in these kind of vague, sweeping notions that there was somehow a family history back in the day. Everything was unclear, but there was some family history of distilling or some whiskey thing is the way that I put it. But I heard little whisperings of that, overheard aunts and uncles and cousins, kind of older generation, talking about back in the day, if we could only find that old spring and bring the old, distillery back. But I didn't know what that meant. I mean, I'm talking when I was like 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, I would hear those little things, but didn't really know what they meant.
Mm-hmm. So obviously this is kind of a changing point in your young adult life. It sparked some inspiration. How did you really get into this project?
We had the inspiration sparked and knew we had this energy to go toward reopening a distillery. And then, okay, next question, how do you do that? And it was really a matter for us of finding the right people to be able to help guide us towards that North Star and tell us, so we're here in Nashville, so we're right in the middle of whiskey, American whiskey country, bourbon and Tennessee whiskey. So we had plenty of distilleries and still do around us. And so we were within a 3-hour drive of, the vast majority of whiskey knowledge as far as we knew in the country. And so we just kind of reached out to anybody we knew, find contacts at different distilleries, anybody, we ended up finding a guy who had a kind of distant cousin who worked in a pretty high position at a large distillery here in Tennessee. And it was really cool back in those days. I mean, that was again, 2006, 2007. And we didn't know what we didn't know. I don't really like saying that, but that kind of is true. And so it was really just going in with an open mind and saying, what is this? Tell me what this even is before we could even get into, and how do you do it? And so that was a lot of fun. I mean, it was the old proverbial drinking from a fire hose kind of moment that lasted a few years, honestly. But we'd run into people who were very helpful and very nice. And frankly, most people were very, very nice and appreciated us trying to do what we were doing. Because at that point, there wasn't yet this huge sort of national and international craft distilling boom that there was, that really kind of took off just a few years later. And so every now and then we'd find, one guy in particular who was on the really like the hardcore chemistry, fermentation side, laboratory side of things. And he was really your typical scientist guy, your sort of prototypical scientist, stereotypical, I'd say, where not maybe a ton of social skills. And he just started talking our ear off about yeast strains. And we're in like, we barely know how to define whiskey. So let's start from there. But he just kind of couldn't hear it. And it was an interesting experience to get that, though, hearing, well, holy crap. I mean, it was at the very least an idea of what we didn't know. It was, oh my God, there's so much here to learn. So it was good and intimidating for sure.
I imagine. And as you're kind of going through this exploration of different distilleries, getting a lot of information about the industry, was there a point in time when you were able to learn more about your family history? Like, was that available, or was that information a little lost?
A little of both, honestly. And it was not only one point in time, but kind of the whole time. We over the years were always in touch with people, from the town of Greenbrier or the historical society there, and other family members. And we just kind of always had our ears out and eyes out for different artifacts that may become available, whether it be from auction or someone just happens to know that we're trying to get this thing back up and running, and they have a connection to somebody who may have seen a bottle at some point before, and an original bottle from pre-prohibition, and all those kind of things. And so we were always, and also spending time in, the city, state, county archives, looking through historical documents. And it was a big deep dive into all kinds of research, from historical research, family research, a lot of like looking through our family tree and kind of developing that. And then how to make whiskey. I mean, not only, like I said before, learning really what whiskey even is. And I don't mean that in the most literal way. We knew what whiskey was. I mean, we had been to college, but you know what I mean? I couldn't give you the TTB definition. And so all of that, and just wrapping our heads around the universe of whiskey, and particularly bourbon and Tennessee whiskey at that time.
Let's talk a little bit more about, you discovering how to make whiskey.
Yeah, that was for me the most exciting part of the journey, because once we got to a point, and this, by the way, took years and years. I mean, like I said, we discovered this family history that had been lost in 2006. I was 23, and we didn't get our first product to market until 2012. And that first product to market that we had wasn't even our own distillate yet. It was sourced. And so along the way, I was learning more and more about the theory of distilling and really visiting as many distilleries as I could. And also along the way, we got introduced to a guy named Dave Pickerel from former the master distiller of Maker's Mark at that time. And he had just started, left Makers and started his own consulting business. And a bit of a legendary figure in the craft spirits industry now.
Just a bit.
He, I believe we were his second clients that he took on. But it took us so long to raise money and do all that, that he had so many clients in between the time he started with us and then that we got started distilling. We were not his only client. And so now kind of everybody knows him, the old Johnny Appleseed of the craft distilling world, as people have called him.
Mm-hmm.
But so we got in touch with Dave and we met him at 4th Street Live in downtown Louisville at the Makers Lounge, where they of course all knew him. And just had a meeting and we asked him what he was all about, what he could help with. And I mean, he's just a big gregarious fellow and everybody kind of likes him as soon as you meet him. And we really liked what he had going on. And it was just him, at the very beginning, it was just him. So as his business grew, more people came on board and kind of helped him out here and there, but he was the guy. And so we hired him, and then he helped us with a handful of things, like taking the sourced whiskey and choosing what we wanted the source to be, what the blend was going to be, the proof, and really like digging into the blending world of it and the sensory aspect of it, which it turned out to be. Now, my brother Charlie and I have similar yet very different personalities. It's kind of a yin and yang type thing with us. And he is more kind of a big picture thinker, like big ideas. And I'm more, let's take this idea and look at how to do it. So more detail oriented. Mm-hmm. And so that naturally by itself got each of us a little more geared toward which part of the business we would be controlling. And that is to say, he was more sales, marketing, and business. And I was the head distiller once we actually opened the distillery. So I was in charge of production and operations. But the reason it also worked out well is because, not to brag or anything, Charlie, but I have a bit more sensitive palate than he does. And it's just our minds go better to like focusing on every single little detail while I'm in it. And his, while you're tasting whiskey, is kind of more, I like big idea comparisons. And anyway, it just kind of worked out well that those were going to be our departments. And so there was that learning. And I really actually, I have a lot to say about my personal experience and therefore my kind of opinion on the sort of art and science combination of both the blending and distilling world, at least in whiskey. I have a very particular experience. And so I'm really glad that I got to learn and kind of hone my chops in the blending world before I got to the distilling world, because that helped me develop my sensory capabilities and my palate and just kind of sophistication in that area of the business. And then, distilling is, I was not a scientist anyway, so it was always for me going to be a little bit more on the side of the art of distilling as opposed to the science of it. And so with that in mind, it was like, if I already had a more sophisticated palate, then I would know what to do with that resulting distillate, and knew that I would, and our team too, I was not the only one doing this, but knew that I and our team we would get better at distilling. We'd learn more. And that was in some ways, it was a mechanical process that we just had to hone and get better at. But that's kind of in a different way than honing and getting better at the palate sophistication and all that.
Right. Like developing your palate takes quite quite a while, and it's nice to have, the time to work with. I'm assuming, most of the finished barrels that you had to work with were very good quality. So you get to kind of deal with that quality, see what is good and bad, see how to get that to work together, and then see how that can translate to your own product that you're creating too, and where there are challenges and differences.
Totally. And that was, one of the most kind of magical things that I learned that stuck out to me was the idea that there is this sort of alchemy to blending barrels, right? You have these very particular, aspects and notes that you'll taste in one barrel, and you think maybe it'll blend well with a complementary taste from another barrel, but then you put them together and they're actually like, wow, this did not work at all when you really expected it to, or vice versa. And it's, that was such an interesting and important thing for me to learn, because I'm very much kind of a cerebral decision maker, if that makes sense, and kind of going with my gut and just feeling out like, of course you add in the more, I don't know, scientific process with it. You write down your notes and you write down all these things and kind of map it out on paper and get an idea of what might work. But ultimately, to me, the final decision maker is my palate. I mean, I don't know that that's different for anybody, to be honest. Just because something may be good on paper does not mean it's going to be good on your palate. So yeah, that to me was a really, really interesting and important thing, just keeping my mind open to what is reality versus what you might expect from something that might not end up being the case.
You guys started with sourcing whiskey. Eventually, you also opened your own distillery. And so you were producing your own stock. Did you have a in-between time where you were blending stuff that was produced offsite and in-house? Or like how did that potential transition period go?
Yeah, so I mean, we kind of did, but not really in terms of finished bottle, at least at first. So we continued with our sourcing, and that was, originally it was MGP, and we used a couple different mash bills, a couple different yeast strains as our source product, and that was for the brand Belle Meade Bourbon. And then when we opened our distillery, part of the reason that Belle Meade was the first brand that we even released was because we wanted to distill all of our own for the Nelson's Greenbrier Tennessee whiskey brand. And so we were pretty specific about that. And so once we opened our own distillery, we started filling barrels with distillate of the mash bill and brand of Greenbrier Tennessee whiskey. And Belle Meade was always sourced. And so they were two distinctive different products. I mean, I guess the closest we came to doing what you were asking about in the transitionary phase was with Greenbrier. We had a product called First 108, which was, when we first started, there was this idea of, I mean, there's kind of always been this idea that this, aging whiskey in smaller barrels gets you, matures faster, which is, I have a whole theory on why that's a problematic statement. In terms of the particulars of it, but that was kind of like the prevailing thought among a lot of folks, especially those who were not real like chemistry nerds or hardcore longtime distillers and such. We started aging in some small barrels, and that is to say 30-gallon barrels as opposed to the standard 53. But we also aged in 53s, so we did about half of our barrels were 30 gallons and half 53s, each year. And then basically it was a matter of tweaking our business plan and our projections and kind of numbers like that, such that we were able to wean ourselves off of the 30-gallon barrels more quickly than, we had originally planned, which was a huge relief to me. I didn't necessarily want to be aging in smaller barrels at first, but it's, you got to do what you got to do as a business starting from $0. And so what we did was we stopped our 30-gallon barrel filling, and we ended up with 108 of those barrels, those 30-gallon barrels. And so we took that distillate and made it a brand called First 108, and it was the same mash bill, same yeast, same everything as what resulted from the 53-gallon barrels and is now Greenbrier Tennessee whiskey. But it was aged in 30-gallon barrels for about 2 years. So that was an interesting experiment. And that was, let's see, we released that, I think, in 2017. And so even then, my God, that's been 7 years. Like it's kind of interesting to think of they still do exist, but it's like a 2-year whiskey in 30-gallon barrels, I think was maybe more common back 6-7 years ago than it is probably today.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I don't know if that answers your question. We, I guess, never really did blend our own distillate with sourced spirit. But over the years, yeah, that's become a thing that we've tried out before.
All right, and hold that thought for just a second. If you're planning a distillery or brewery launch, adding a distillery to your brewery, or considering purchasing an existing brewing or distilling business, then visit breweryworkshop.com for more information about the Brewery and Distillery Workshop brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling and Craft Beer and Brewing. Over 4 days, you'll learn what it takes to get a successful craft beverage business off the ground through panel discussions, working group sessions, technical tours, and more. Get your ticket now at breweryworkshop.com. Following up along this thread, was the reason to not try to combine techniques because you didn't want to? Was that a business strategy? Was that a distillation strategy? Where did that separation come from?
A little bit of all that, because the brands of Greenbrier and Belle Meade were two fundamentally different mash bills, for one, because these are historic brands that we knew kind of what the mash bills were, at least for a Greenbrier Tennessee whiskey. And that was a wheated Tennessee whiskey. So that's a pretty specific thing. That's hard to get at any, especially back then, at any distillery that would do contract production for someone. So because it was a Tennessee whiskey, we couldn't just ask MGP or really anyone else. No one outside the state of Tennessee could legally produce our product if we wanted to have Tennessee whiskey on the label. And so we couldn't even do that if we wanted. But I don't know. I can't speak for them. That was just kind of how we assumed it to be. And so there's that. And then Belle Meade was it was a bourbon. I mean, it was an Indiana bourbon, at least at first. And so high rye bourbon. And so different product really altogether. And so we even had, a time where with Belle Meade, with the sourced spirit, you have to, or at least we did, it first started kind of, we changed the blend a little bit, but just to kind of maintain that consistency. That's one of the issues with blending or sourcing, rather, is that, unless you're contracting the production yourself, and exactly what's being made that you own each year, if you're just kind of buying off the bulk market, which was what we were doing at first, there's going to be a lot more potential for flavor drift because your inventory is kind of always changing, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's not always going to be as consistent as you'd like it because you're just leaning on the bulk market and whatever's out there is, and something may not be available anymore.
Absolutely. It's definitely a difficult thing to work with, especially when you're starting and, you don't have the ability to maybe buy a ton of barrels all at once.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But then it also goes directly to the point I was making before, is that, when we were first getting started, it was kind of like, we're just jumping in the deep end, doing things in that way, like the hard way, because we didn't, for one, know any better, and we, two, couldn't afford any better. And so we were just learning it all and, doing it with the more difficult sort of resources, so to speak, because that's all we could deal with at the time.
Totally. Well, I'd love to take the opportunity to ask you a question that I feel like our industry understands, obviously, but it's complicated. And that is basically, what is Tennessee whiskey? How does it differentiate? And then I'd love for you to chat more about your historical recipe as well.
Yeah, I am very excited that you asked me that, because I love answering this question. It is the particular thing that I will go into great detail about this if we want, but remind me to talk about sour mash, the term right after this too.
Perfect.
So Tennessee whiskey is, by my estimation, and I will take this to the grave with me because, when anything is a definition according to anything written on paper, someone's going to interpret it differently than someone else, inevitably. So Tennessee whiskey is bourbon because it meets all the criteria of bourbon, which is to say made in the United States from at least 51% corn and aged in unused charred oak containers. So it meets all those, as well as the specific production criteria, which is can't come off the still at higher than 160 proof, can't go in a barrel at higher than 125, and can't go in a bottle at lower than 80 proof. So there are those items, and Tennessee whiskey and bourbon meet all of those criteria. Tennessee whiskey, though, has a little bit more specific rules, which is to say, not only does it have to be made, which is, in this case, distilled and aged in the state of Tennessee in particular, and it also has to undergo the charcoal mellowing process, which is called sometimes the Lincoln County process. I often compare it to like a giant Brita filter for your whiskey. You're just filtering the whiskey, whether pre or post barrel, through charcoal. Historically, it is sugar maple charcoal, and I have, in fact, gotten the question before, what does sugar maple charcoal mean? And it just means it's charcoal from a sugar maple tree. Mm-hmm. Shout out sugar maple, or old distillery cat. And oh yeah, she's beautiful. Not very sweet, but she's a good one. So that's what Tennessee whiskey is. So in other words, all Tennessee whiskey is bourbon, but not all bourbon is Tennessee whiskey, much in the way that all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. So it's just a slightly different and more specified standard of identity. Mm-hmm. So there's that. And then the complication of the term sour mash. Now, there's nothing legally, I'll get into this also. There's nothing legally requiring Tennessee whiskey to be made by the sour mash or with the sour mash process. But of course, Jack Daniel's historically has the word sour mash on the label. And so everyone, generally, not everyone, but most people will equate the term sour mash with Tennessee whiskey or with a very specific flavor profile that is typically that of Jack Daniel's. And so I spend a lot of time trying to educate people on the fact that sour mash is, if someone will come up to me and say, I don't like sour mash, I'm like, well, what's your bourbon of choice then? And they'll name whatever it is, and it's coming from, let's say it's a bigger distillery. They're using the sour mash process almost definitely. Mm-hmm. And sometimes people are receptive to hearing that and understanding and learning, but it's kind of shocking and amazing how many people just like literally will not believe me when I'll tell them that sour mash is just a process. It's like making sourdough bread. You got the starter or the mother, and you kind of pick off a little bit of that to make your next batch, and then you take a little bit of that to make the next one, and on and on. And sometimes people just don't want to hear it, but it's interesting. Anyway, all that to say, we had sour mash on the Greenbrier Tennessee whiskey label because that's what it had 150 years ago, and that's the way that we made it. And so, for better or worse, sometimes people would see that word and not want to buy a bottle, but they're lost.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah. So what would you like to know about the historical recipe?
So, it was something that you must have discovered at some point in your journey. It's a family recipe, correct?
It is, yeah. So it belongs to my great-great-great-grandfather, Charles Nelson. And basically the way that it worked for him was that he had a grocery store pretty much on 2nd Avenue, downtown Nashville, back in the 1870s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And he was rectifying whiskey. He was taking distillate from the distillery up in Greenbrier, Tennessee, which is about 45-minute drive north of Nashville, a little bit northwest. And this distillery was making his whiskey, and he was branding it as Nelson's Greenbrier Tennessee whiskey, or rather just as Greenbrier Tennessee whiskey. And so there was that recipe, and he ended up getting out of the grocery business to buy the distillery that was producing his whiskey. And so he started then making it, he became the owner of the distillery and was making it all himself. So, so he had the recipe, of course. And as far as our discovery of it, it was nothing like this romantic notion of finding a leather-bound ledger in the back of an old safe or anything. It was more, we kind of pieced it together. So through all of our historical research and everything, we found a handful of documents. One, we found like IRS tax documents, or whatever the IRS would have been called back in those days, for grain purchases of various types, and actual grain receipts for like which grains he would buy in which particular quantities. And so we kind of extrapolated from there, like, okay, for one, it's a wheated whiskey. It has corn, wheat, and malted barley. Mm-hmm. There was no rye in it, though we did end up finding out later that he produced a 4-grain Tennessee whiskey at some point with rye in it as well. But so we found this, and then and so we had this idea of what it would be, and then we came across this newspaper article from the Nashville Tennessean in I can't even remember if it's 1878 or 87, but anyway, it talked about every year Charles Nelson would have a picnic on his facility, in his big distillery grounds, and they'd give tours and tastings and all, or at least tours in the distillery, and it was just like a big party. It was like a marketing event, like any distillery would do. It's like inviting, just have a big party, come to our distillery, hang out, blah, blah, blah. So they'd give tours of the facility, and there was a journalist on one of these tours, and his production guy gave all these details. And I'm assuming he didn't just volunteer them, but the guy was probably asking specific questions, and he was answering them. And to the point where the next day in the newspaper was published, like in great detail, down to, the hold times and how hot they would get the mash and all this, like specific details of a production SOP, like a mash cooking SOP and stuff, that was pretty astonishing. But what we also found was it kind of confirmed the extrapolation that we made from the grain receipts and the proportion of grains he would buy at any given time. And so we knew more that, okay, here's what the mash bill really was, XYZ percentages of corn, wheat, and malted barley, and here's how they made it back in the day. We changed a bit, or probably even more than a bit, of things like temperatures and hold times, and we had different equipment, we had different ways of kind of direct inject steam, and our boiler is probably a lot more powerful than there was. It was just all these very specific things that aren't necessarily going to translate to modern day equipment and technology and efficiency and stuff. So that's kind of how that all happened.
That's amazing. So the role that you've played with Nelson Greenbrier is both as a founder and as a maker. And that's kind of a difficult things to kind of wrap your head around, having both of those roles, because sometimes they collide. You're talking about having this really amazing product, but you're also dealing with sales and marketing in some aspect because you're a founder of a company. Can you talk about that balance?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to experience, because it led to, for me, a lot of, over time, like, imposter syndrome is kind of the right word, but it was just like questioning myself. And, over time I got a little weird, because at first it was me and this other guy, Goodlow, who were the production, like it was the two of us on the still cooking every mash, taking care of all the fermentation, like doing the entire production other than bottling, where at that point we would just invite a bunch of people over and give them pizza and beer to help us bottle up product. But it's long ago. But anyway, going from that and being, I was so thrilled. It was so exciting and so fulfilling to be out there on the production floor, like sweating, walking around, physically, tangibly putting your hands on things and making a product. I mean, that's just, there's nothing quite like that if you're excited about what you're making. And so then as things changed and we grew, and it became a thing where we had a larger production staff and people that I trusted to make the product, I stepped a little bit further away from that and got gradually more into the market visits and sales and stuff like that. And so as that happened, I had this, like, I kind of lost confidence in myself as I felt this weird almost guilt about having the title head distiller, because it's like, well, I'm not doing as much as, these other people. They're actually the ones day to day, but it just kind of took me a while to sort of understand and accept, rather, that, this is part of being a head distiller in this business. Like, there's a million different directions that I'm getting pulled. And I am still the head distiller. It is ultimately like my palate making the judgment calls and my approvals of everything, even if I'm not physically on the floor every single day anymore. But it really was a weird thing, and took me a while of, processing and going through it to get comfortable with, like, this is just the job. I couldn't really not do it like this. It wouldn't be the same. So yeah, there's just so much it is constantly drinking from a fire hose, really. Mm-hmm. Learning new skills and all that, because the skills of a production manager or just a distiller day to day are fundamentally different from someone who has to be interacting with people and in a sales capacity every day. I mean, they're so different, and so there's a lot of cross training, I guess.
Absolutely. I like to describe it as very different hats you have to wear, and it can be extremely challenging to go between the hats.
Yeah, that's totally it. And it can take a minute to get comfortable and confident wearing one particular hat for the first time, so that's pretty good. It's a good apt analogy.
So we referenced earlier the art and science of making whiskey, and it's very, very complicated. There's a delicate balance with those things. There's also, like we talked about, delicate balance of being a founder and going to market visits and all that stuff. Let's dive a little bit more into just the art and science of making the product and then marketing it and selling it.
Yeah. That to me is a big. I've thought so much about this, and thinking about it has actually allowed me to gain a lot more confidence in my place in the industry and just this world. Like, I remember the first kind of thing that blew my mind about this blend of art and science was going to the ACSA conference it was in Chicago, and what was it, 2016 or something like that. And I, was so fresh to the industry, hadn't been to an ACSA conference before. It was still a relatively young organization. And I went to a seminar about the chemistry of distilling, because I am not a scientist, didn't know much. I've taken chemistry before in high school, and that was about the limits of it. And I cannot remember who was giving this seminar, but it was completely fascinating and mind-blowing and overwhelming and intimidating all at the same time, because they were using all these words and endings and things that are like protease and sort of enzymatic activity, sort of terminology that I knew from chemistry. And I understand that this is the root word and this is the ending and something about how that works, but I had no clue how it applied to distilling or fermentation. And I mean, not no clue. I had some idea, like Dave Pickerel had taught me how to make whiskey already. So I got that, but it was more, I am not a lifetime scientist. So it was yet another example of, wow, I have so much to learn. And so after that, I walked around like, I do not belong here. What am I doing? I'm a fraud. And over the years, I continued to go to as many of the kind of chemistry and hardcore science seminars and education sessions as I could, so I could just absorb that and learn it. but I was naturally much more inclined to lean into the art and the kind of energy of, and almost like psychic energy of whiskey and making any product and putting the love into it and that kind of aspect. And so I knew that they're both obviously very important, but the point is it took me years to like gain confidence and understanding. Just because I'm not a trained scientist doesn't make me any less good or less valid, doesn't make me any less valid in this industry than anybody else. Because there are people who come from the science world, there are people who come from the business world, and there's people like me who came from the kind of historical angle, and then let's figure out how to make a good product. And so kind of working through all of that was a struggle for a few years, just in terms of my own confidence and feeling like I actually belonged here, because I knew who knew what the good science was behind this stuff, and I just had to slowly learn it. But I found, the point is this, that I found this spectrum kind of there's, at the very end of each of the spectrum is one, there'd be making the kind of, in air quotes, a scientifically perfect product, whatever that is for your brand, like extremely high quality and everything is like clean and perfect and blah, blah, blah. And then the other end of the spectrum would be like making absolute garbage, or just blending something, maybe even blending something that is already good and blending it into a way that like minimizes what it actually could be. And just taking like garbage product, but being able to market the hell out of it and really, you're selling the brand, even if the product itself is maybe subpar, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea of coming somewhere in the middle, like we were closer to the artistic understanding, and like we got good enough at selling and understanding how to sell a brand. But then for me anyway, and I imagine most people, I am not a natural salesman. It is not my personality to be able to just like sell me this pen and then somehow impress someone enough to sell them this pen. If it is not a product that I absolutely believe in and love myself, I'm like, I don't care, if you like it, go ahead, like that's fine, but that's your decision. And so for me to be able to successfully sell something, I have to really, really, truly believe in it. And so I am totally unwilling to just stay on that side of, well, the product doesn't matter, it's all about the sales pitch. Mm-hmm. I don't believe in that at all. And so finding that middle ground has been it's just been an evolution. We never really allowed ourselves to stay on one end of the spectrum or the other. That's why it's a spectrum. There's kind of all points in between. And so just striking that balance has been a really big, important thing to me. And it's been kind of amazing to see over the years, brands come and go, and companies and distilleries that come and go. And sometimes they're just kind of amazing at one, but not great at the other, and vice versa. And sometimes it's some other external force that'll get something to close. But I don't know. I've gained a keener eye at just being able to look at a shelf set and see like, okay, these people don't care at all. And that's just kind of an interesting thing to walk around a liquor store and see a brand that I've never seen before. That's like, it looks like the label was printed on, Microsoft Paint or whatever at your home printer. I'm like, what are you even thinking?
And you just hope the product's really good.
Yeah. But even if it is, it could literally be the best that's ever been tasted objectively, and it's not going to sell. So, I don't know really what my point is there. It to me is just like always on my mind in terms of connecting, kind of tying together the product integrity side and the business side, because those are on the surface, on the faces, those things can be inherently kind of contrary to one another. The quest for making a profit versus the quest for making a great product. They don't always kind of work out that well together. So that to me is there's some sort of, well, I don't know if it's magic, but there's a lot of compromise, I will say, at least in that whole world.
Well, and it's an interesting viewpoint. You have to have, a good product. You also have to have really good branding, marketing. And then, like, if you have both of those things, you might be successful. There's still the might. Like, it's not not an instant recipe for success.
Yeah, I talked to this guy who was a NASCAR driver a year ago or something, and he was telling me about if you own a NASCAR team, you own basically 8 different businesses, because you own a sports franchise, you own a marketing company, you own a logistics company, it's like all these different aspects to that business, because they're traveling all the time, and the cars are just painted in advertisements, and that's how they get their money, and blah blah blah. So to me, I had never thought of it this way, but a distillery is in a lot of ways the same, because you own a production facility in like a factory, but you also own a product. It's a factory, but it's also a high quality product manufacturing plant. It's not a food production facility, but like there is that kind of artistic and creative endeavor attached to it. And you own, well, it's a marketing company. It's an advertising company. There are all these different aspects that you really have to kind of be. You're almost more likely to succeed being that jack of all trades, master of none kind of a thing than you are if you are a master of one thing but can't do anything else well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such an interesting thing to just think about. I nerd out just thinking about that and all the different possibilities in that world, but it's what it is.
Totally. And, success is an interesting thing in our industry as well. It's kind of the measurement there doesn't really exist. However, you guys have had some successful things happen in your company history. Do you want to talk about what happened in the last, was it 5 years? How long has it been?
Yeah. It's been 5 years, almost exactly. And what you're referring to there, I'm guessing, is we had a partnership with Constellation Brands, starting really in 2016. So we'd grown the business, and we were there. It's always a struggle, but we were really hoping we had these big ambitions. Our goal was never to just be like a small local or even regional business. We wanted to be big. I mean, we wanted to be national and global and like that. Like, that was kind of success to us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just not everybody's idea of success. And it's kind of what makes the world go round. And so we kept growing and decided and kind of realized that, I had these big ambitions of like, well, we don't want to partner with any big company. Like, let's start our own big company. Like, why don't we become the next, Constellation or Diageo or Brown or whatever? And that's not going to happen in our lifetime, because again, we're not trained business people either.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just going to be really tough to do that. And so ultimately we realized that we've got to do this strategic partnership if we want to really get distribution up and running, like in a way that we can grow to our ambitions in our lifetime. And so we ended up going into this minority partnership with Constellation in 2016, when they kind of had their ventures portfolio, is what they called it. And we were one of the very early brands in their ventures portfolio, which is, the way that worked is they gave us a small, or it was a big investment for us, but tiny for them. And so their philosophy was, this is a drop in the bucket to us, and I know it's meaningful to you. So, if you guys fail tomorrow, so be it. We tried, we thought it would work. No big loss for us. But if you succeed, then, we can help you succeed and grow. And we have all these resources that you don't currently have. And so we'll figure it out at some point. So we thought that's great. And they were very hands off on things in the ventures portfolio. And we kept growing to the point where in 2019, we made a majority deal with them. We sold them the majority stake of the company. And so got involved in all the resources that they had to offer, and their, national distribution network and all these things that we just didn't have access to before. Honestly, the most like relieving things to us was like an HR department, accounting, where we didn't have to be printing out all the checks every single day or week or whatever. And it's all those little administrative things were a huge burden. So over the next 5 years, it ended up, things just kind of changed and became what they were. And I ended up leaving the distillery this past March. It felt great, actually, I feel like in my mind, I've had such an interesting experience with it. And I don't think it's one that everybody has. Everybody's got their own different ambitions and stuff. And I was even surprised myself by my reaction to it was that, I definitely always wanted to get to be a big international brand and be able to one of the most exciting things to me was the notion of the possibility of going and traveling internationally, traveling around the world and just being able to tell our story and, share our story with people, looking them in the eye and, having a sip of whiskey together. And that the romance of that is intoxicating. Mm-hmm. And so that's such a big part of how I still feel. And I'd love to do that. But over the years, then we kind of did, I don't know, it's just everything changes. The world changes, it's a different thing. And to be honest, I don't want to talk about too much detail here. But the point is, a lot of people deemed that or would think of our majority stake acquisition from Constellation as a great success. And in so many ways it absolutely was, but it was not always, it was not our end all be all. In fact, it was when we were first seeking individual investments in 2010, 11, people would ask us, well, what's your exit strategy? And we literally said to them, we don't have one. We don't want to, we want to be doing this for the rest of our lives. And that made it harder to get our investment, but it also allowed it to be the case that the people who were willing to buy into that were the right money, so to speak. They were very hands off. They trusted us and believed in us. And so that was, yet another tangent here, but that was a big part of it. And so all that to say, it's been such an interesting journey and evolution from the point of we do not have an exit strategy because we want to be in this the rest of our lives to I left the business a few months ago and I actually feel great. I'm having a great time. So it's amazing just how things can change and, how you can surprise yourself by how you end up reacting to something.
Totally. Life comes at you fast. And are you able to talk about what you might be working on now?
Yeah, I've got a handful of irons in the fire, as they say, but it's not all spirits or even this industry related. But one thing I have started doing is working with the folks at Big Thirst. And so with Mark Schilling, it's kind of consulting with Big Thirst, which has been really cool. Mark is awesome, Matt is awesome, and everybody there is really cool. And it's been a lot of fun to kind of learn about this side of the business. The consulting world is so, in some ways, very different, but in some ways I'm like, this is exactly what I know. Mm-hmm. I've done this before in different stages, and I just saw the experiences from every phase of the business has been really valuable, and it's been a big learning experience to me. It's hard to understand, I guess, the meaning or the value in when someone talks about how you learn so much from teaching. Mm-hmm. And this happened to me when I was first learning the steps. It was when Dave Pickerel had this list of here's the first step, here's the second step, here's the third, and it was 5 pages long of just step by step for just mashing, cooking mash. And I was like, oh my God. And it was at first overwhelming, and I kept, but we did it and then got good at it and blah, blah, blah. And we hired our first person, and I was the one who trained him. And to me, training him and teaching him exactly what I learned, it opened my eyes to a different perspective and made me understand the process just that much more. Mm-hmm. And so it's also really interesting coming from an unbiased third party perspective, looking at someone who is at X stage of business, and they're thinking about it this one way, and I can come at it and say, I know exactly where you're thinking, but if I'm being totally unbiased, it's just removing that filter. It just changes perspective so much, and in such an important way. Really valuable stuff. But anyway, I knew you didn't ask about that part, but that's a really big benefit I've found to consulting. I haven't been doing it long, I've mostly just been talking to Mark and getting a feel for distilleries around who reach out to us and want to figure out more.
Well, I think that's the beautiful part about consulting is it gives you a lot of ability to learn yourself, a lot of insight on how other people are, doing production. There's such a variety of techniques out there, and that the more that you get to work with others, you just learn how to improve processes and gain new information.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, every year we would, or at least every 2 years, we would take our whole production staff out to a field trip up to Kentucky or throughout other parts of Tennessee and just like visit other distilleries and have a look at what they're doing. And it's not like it was a spying thing. I mean, I actually reach out to the production managers there and they'd say, yeah, we're happy to help out. And it's one of those like really magical things about this industry. I find that, the sales, that's a different world really, in the, shelf sets and putting bottles in other places from other brands and that old song and dance. But it's such I guess a relief that I felt very early on about like, wow, this industry is amazing because all the production people are almost 100% just so nice and helpful to one another and willing to share techniques, ideas, vendors, and just share with that rather than taking the approach of, well, I'm not giving my competition, any kind of edge because I don't know. It's not always that they're competition. There's kind of room for everybody. And it's been really fun to see that the whole industry itself grow.
Absolutely. I think that's my favorite thing about being in production is that there is the thought that I don't even think it's a thought we think of. We're just so excited to share. People can't like resist the urge of just diving into the geekiness that can be our industry, whether it's really the science side or, just managing production and all the complications that come with that and sharing, war stories at the same time. So it's an amazing thing to be a part of.
Yeah, I had not, until just this moment, I'd never thought of this analogy, but it is kind of like your, again, kind of stereotypical high school environment or middle school environment where it's like, and I certainly don't mean this is like to offend anybody, but it's, if you think about it, in theory, it's like the sales team is like, they're the jocks, they're the alphas, they're competing, going hard and trying to beat the opponent. And we're like the nerds just sharing our notes about, chemistry or Dungeons and Dragons or whatever it may be, but we're all like cool and friendly, and also we're the ones that are gonna run the world one day. But that, I don't know. Yeah, it's funny. I had never thought about that. So I don't know if it's a great analogy, but it occurred to me just now.
Well, I love it. And what a great place to end this podcast. I love that little wisdom nugget. Andy, thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Yeah, thank you. Same, very much.
For more than 30 years, G&D Chillers has had the proven solution for distilleries. Visit them today at gdchillers.com. Whether establishing a new distillery or expanding into a brewdistillery, ABS Commercial is your full-service equipment manufacturer for equipment ranging from 50 liters to 5,000 liters. Visit breweryworkshop.com to secure your ticket to this September's Brewery and Distillery Workshop. If you've enjoyed this podcast, go to spiritsanddistilling.com and sign up for our free newsletter featuring new stories every week from some of the best writers and distillers in the distilling world. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another in-depth distilling conversation for you. Thanks for joining us. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling for those who love to make and drink great spirits. Join our free newsletter today at spiritsanddistilling.com for pragmatic, technical, and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Sign up now at spiritsanddistilling.com or click on the link in the show notes.